Pressure is mounting on African heads of states to come up with a comprehensive plan to deal with Nigeria's Boko Haram militants. West African leaders will seek authority from the African Union to create a multinational force to fight the Nigerian insurgents. AU leaders are meeting in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa on Friday. Any such force will represent the most robust international response yet to the militants who have killed thousands over the last year in their campaign for an Islamic State. Earlier, we spoke to Professor Lesiba Teffo and asked him why it's taking long to establish such a force.
What would the makeup of this force be, and what would its agenda be?
Well, the makeup in the main would be continental. If any assistance were to come through, it will have to follow due process, and possibly maybe some other parts of the world. Europe and continental Europe might want perhaps to support through logistical supplies, but not foot soldiers. I suspect that not. I also want to believe that the meeting will, for once, want to be seen to be taking genuine, practical, and implementable decisions short-term, if possible. I'm saying this because I think they are operating under a sense of urgency and under an understanding that they've been relatively slow to react and to respond to the situation, and they've somehow been overtaken by other developments in other parts of the world that are seemingly taking more serious the issue that they themselves ought to have addressed.
From when it was formed to when it was called the Organization of African Unity to date, is this thing not long overdue, if one may to argue in that manner?
Look, it is long overdue, no doubt about that. The problem is there are self-interests, there are regional interests. Rather than to put the public before the self, you find that states and head of states are more concerned about the preservation of their legacies, their individual interest, rather than the interest of the nations or the people they serve. I'm saying this precisely because you would understand and you would know that even in cases where there are glaring, ample evidence of human rights abuse, we will find our own trying to defend one another. And you begin to wonder, should the West step in to tell us it is wrong, right, to abuse your own, never mind what the reasons are? And later on, when they intervene, then we want to cry foul. I have in mind here, by the way, the case of the ICC, where oftentimes African heads of states want to cry foul and suggest that it is biased against African states. There might be some elements of truth, but that is not sufficient reason to detract from the fact that our own, right, the likes of Ruto, the likes of Kenyatta, the likes of Taylor, Al-Shabir in Sudan, ought to have been brought to book. Same applies to at least Robert Mugabe, by the way. So when we defend our own at our own expense, then we mustn't look at the stars and try to cry foul and say the fault is with the stars rather than with ourselves.
You just took us back to the issue of regional blocs and country sovereignty. The intervention of France in Mali not so long ago saw relationships between different regional blocs hemorrhaged. Where does this place the African Union in this particular case?
It puts them in a very, very dark light. For me, the African Union has never really acquitted itself well. The rationale for its founding is noble, is commendable, but its exercise, application, and practice leaves very much to be desired, especially when they tend to defend their own against blatant abuse of state resources, blatant abuse of their own, the plundering of resources in the interest of the few rather than of the nation, stealing resources and investing them in the West, and in turn, the West sending crumbs to us, and the West also purporting to help us, but using our own resources, at least to sponsor, to donate, and to contribute to our own welfare. There's a contradiction there. We steal and give the West, and the West take the loot and come at least purporting now to be donors to help us.
Some of the problems that you have mentioned are most of the time a harbinger to the conflict that we have on the continent, which brings us to the question of how prepared are we to deal with issues of conflict prevention as opposed to countering it?
There are several organs that were conceived and instituted to help to give effect to the mandate of the AU. And some of them are doing a wonderful job, but others are not, especially in relation to conflict on the African continent. You will recall, in 2013, ECOWAS came up with a decision really to take Boko Haram head on. Right? They were supposed to come up with at least intelligence sharing structures that would enable them to take preemptive strikes where possible, or collective strike where possible. They were also supposed to put up an anti-terrorism unit that would in turn, if needs be, intervene and try to contend and contest the space in order to protect at least the vulnerable. But that never happened. However, let's hope that this meeting, this time, under these conditions, certainly they have to be seen to be acting, and act they must.
And if we go back and look at the resolutions that were taken by ECOWAS then, they haven't produced any results so far. What is the relationship then of the African Union and ECOWAS in this regard? Should there be measures that are taken from time to time to ensure that regional blocs carry on the resolutions they've put in place?
There's something that is called monitoring and evaluation in the course of the application or implementation of whatever program or projects you are working on. And one would want to believe that all these organs, they've got at least an overseer who ought to ensure that they carry out their mandates. They have failed. Perhaps this is not about bemoaning that, but charting a way forward, because it is urgent that somehow in northern Nigeria, some sense is brought to bear, that collective effort is coordinated to ensure that those that can still be saved and those that can still be brought home, they are.
Professor Teffo, it would perhaps be necessary to talk about the results that military action has produced in dealing with terrorism. Has it produced results anywhere in the world?
You see, the notion or the concept terrorism is a heavily loaded one. I'm more interested in saying, to the extent possible, let's try to ensure that we don't create conditions and the circumstances that make it possible for hardcore fundamentalists, hardcore, cold-hearted, bloodthirsty people to come and act in the name of whatever ideological or religious doctrine. Let's ensure that we, those who are in charge and in the leadership, we dare to create circumstances that make such to germinate and to multiply.
So if we do not,
yes,
if we do not create
yes,
such, allow such circumstances to fester, is military intervention the solution?
Well, look, you know, the deterrence theory says to me, you must arm to the teeth to the extent possible, so that your counterpart knows that you have got the wherewithal to take him or on. That's the first one. The second one, as I think Che Guevara said, and I think even Malcolm X, you can't wage a revolution with a banana in your hand. So at one stage, at least force must be met with force. But I know from experience that oftentimes unconventional war, that like guerrilla warfare waged by the likes of Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, you are not going to win those. You can subdue them. They can go underground, but they will emerge or resurface one way or another. So if we can deal with the conditions that make it possible for such organization to germinate and multiply, let's try to do so.
Talking about bananas, do we have the ammunition necessary then to combat them in summing up? Or do we have the resources to counter these insurgencies as a continent?
I think as a continent we have the wherewithal to deal with this. And remember, we are not a poor continent. We are just mismanaging or under-managing the continent and abusing and misusing the resources. Why is it that our budgets in the main are biased towards defense? Yet at the same time, we can't defend and protect ourselves. We look to the West and elsewhere for protection. Why is it that these groups that you and I are talking about have ammunitions, sophisticated, modern, contemporary ammunitions? Who's sponsoring them? Who's giving them? I do not know. But the fact of the matter is, yes, there are weapons. Yes, there is technical expertise. There is sufficient logistics to deal with the problems that we are faced with. But as long as the circumstances, the material conditions that give birth to those groups to emerge are not dealt with, we'll still have to contend with same now and in the future.